Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because I know that we have people present from all over the world, as far as Nepal and from North America. So that's pretty exciting. And I have to say, this is what I love about Zoom, that we can do this kind of thing. And I think there's a lot of commitment from people who are staying up late or getting up early, showing the real commitment to hear about the issues that we like to bring to our members and to the larger public. So why are we doing this? Over the last few months, there have been reports out of UNHCR that the numbers of people who have been displaced either internally or externally have risen to 100 million, which is an extraordinarily high number. And within that number, we have seen an increase in women migrants. We decided to select three regions, specifically because these three regions are seeing a real rise in women migrants. We are looking at Afghanistan, we're looking at Ukraine, and we're looking at the borders of Latin America and the States. And I think one of the things that we will be really addressing is what are the triggers? Why are these women on the move? And we see a multiple of triggers, including, of course, conflict, repression, human rights issues, but also domestic violence, violence against women. All these things have been a real trigger in forcing women to leave with their families to find a better life. So for us today, we have always the issue of exposing the issue, really trying to understand it, but also seeing if there are ways that we can make a difference. So I would like to, first of all, which I'll do later, thank our amazing panelists, and particularly Heba Ali, who is a very good friend and the CEO of the New Humanitarian. And for those of you who don't know the New Humanitarian, I suggest that you all inscribe, because it is really a place where you can get the real news, and issues which sometimes get forgotten are being addressed. So Heba, thank you so much, and I pass it on to you. Please remember, put your questions in the chat box. Heba is a queen of multitasking, so she said she would manage the chat box as well as moderating, but we will also keep our eye on it. So thanks, Heba. Carry on.
Thanks a lot, Atalanti, and pleasure to be here. I've just put into the chat, actually, the link where you can subscribe if you're interested in news and information about people affected by humanitarian crises around the world. And as Atalanti said, unfortunately, last year, the world hit a new record in the number of people forced to flee their homes. About half of that 100 million figure are women and girls. And we know from our reporting that women and girls pay a doubly heavy price during humanitarian crises, because not only are they navigating the scarcity and the danger, but they typically have added responsibilities of caring for and supporting other family members, often from positions of inequality. And they have their own needs that are often ignored. So take a couple examples that I want to share with you from our reporting. Fatuma is a 17-year-old woman, or girl, I suppose, still from the Ivory Coast, who had been forced to marry when she was 13 years old to a man who beat her severely. And by the time she reached Libya, where she fled, she was pregnant and gave birth to a young boy who was going from detention center to detention center in what we have now documented as cycles of extortion, deprivation, and violence faced by asylum seekers and migrants in Libya. And then she felt she had no choice to get onto a rickety boat. And we have now heard from search and rescue NGOs operating in the central Mediterranean that they have counted thousands of women and children among those they are rescuing off the coast of Libya in recent years. That trend used to be largely single young men. And now, as Atalanti said, we're seeing more and more women, accounting to somewhere between 25 and 40% of the total number of migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean, according to the people we've spoken to. Another example for you from Yemen, a young woman named Anhar Rashad, who had to, for the first time in her life, find a job at 39 years old because her husband was killed in the war and she needed to provide for her son. She got a job earning $27 per month and had to choose between buying food and paying rent. And in Yemen, women account for half of the people considered in acute need. I think the aid community there is starting to recognize that there are particular needs of a particular group of people, women leading households alone because of their husbands being killed, that aren't being met or prioritized in the current response. So those are just some of the stories from a series we host called She Said, a collection of stories in which women are sharing glimpses of their lives from situations of displacement and conflict. And if you're interested in more such stories and from hearing from women directly, I'll also drop that link into the chat. So today, as Atalanti said, we're going to try to understand what drives women to leave their homes and how they are uniquely affected by conflict and displacement, and explore that from 3 different parts of the world. Drop your questions into, excuse me, the chat, and I will turn to them as we go. And I'd like to start by, oh, sorry, I've just given you the wrong link, so my multitasking is not going so well. I will fix that in a minute. I would like to start by introducing Heather. Heather Commenda is a specialist in migrant protection working at the UN's International Organization for Migration. She specializes in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Heather, you've been working on migrant protection, counter-trafficking, child protection for the past 20 years around the world, so in Canada, Southeast Asia, East Africa, Middle East. But I wanted to ask you specifically about Ukraine, just because how timely it is. What are your biggest concerns about the risks for women there?
Thanks so much, Heather, for the introduction. So really what concerns everyone involved in this response is the fact that it's almost a perfect storm of risk factors for women and girls leaving Ukraine and to some extent also within Ukraine. So I would say really there's 3 key factors. The first is that there has been for many decades a fairly established issue with human trafficking from Ukraine. There's been a tremendous amount of work done in Ukraine, but historically this has been a higher risk location anyway. Secondly, with simply the scale of the crisis. So the figures I think accurate as of now is there's been up to 8 million Ukrainians who have left and gone into EU countries. And I think the peak of displacement within the country was close to 7 million. So this is the largest population movement in Europe since the Second World War. This is just the opportunities for exploitation, given that scale and the need of people absolutely is there. And thirdly, the way we see the family separation occurring. So of those people leaving Ukraine, it is 90% women and girls, as the men are staying behind to contribute to the war effort. And this has really put a lot of women into situations they're not familiar with being in, on their own, deciding on their own, facing really challenging circumstances and having to navigate so many issues, the psychosocial impact of what's going on at home, just the emotional toll of the separation and the fact that their country is at war, and then quite pressing needs from children, elderly people, etc. So these really are problematic factors that everybody was concerned with right from the beginning.
And for you as a UN agency trying to respond to this, what are the specific kind of needs of women that you have to adapt to, and how well are you able to do that in terms of catering for questions around whether it's hygiene or pregnancy or, as you say, caretaking of family members? How does that change the way you need to respond to those women who are?
Yeah, well, I think what is really important to keep in mind is what a multi-sectoral large-scale response is required, because people truly were putting suitcases into their car and leaving. I actually visited Moldova in the weeks afterwards, and they said, it's forget about suitcases. We were taking as many bodies, as many humans as we could out of the country. So we came with literally nothing. So I think often the humanitarian needs are prioritized as they should be. What is really interesting here is how effectively and efficiently so many reception countries organized and met those needs. So in opposition to maybe other crises, we didn't see really loss of life related to lack of shelter or lack of food. These basic needs are being met. But then what we are concerned with is a variety of things. So first off, in the immediate aftermath, nobody really knows all the specifics of what's going on. So there was a really big push towards information sharing and really trying to communicate to women what protection risks were there to the extent that they were known. In the very early days, there were reports of sexual violence, some really suspicious cases, potentially trafficking in persons. So really just trying to give people that information, balancing at the same time that it's really tricky to go into a really bad situation and dump more bad information on people, especially when we don't necessarily, nobody knows in the first couple of days what's happening. So I think the humanitarian issue was, of course, the first priority, but secondly, really getting people informed, not only information about protection risks, but information about services they could access, how they could protect themselves. And as we move on now, I think the information needs are differing as we realize that this is really becoming a protracted situation, and women need to think, how are they going to organize their lives moving forward? And dealing with the changing dynamics. Obviously, the response was tremendously compassionate, but people do get compassion fatigue and structures do get overwhelmed. And as we move into months, years, I think we're now at the point where we want to think through, how do we support women in their lives in the next decade as ideally they recover from this situation?
And you alluded to it, but as displacement becomes more protracted, there's a higher risk of women being pushed into exploitative situations. What have you been seeing in terms of, you're actually co-chairing a task force on anti-trafficking for the Ukraine refugee response. Has that materialized, the risk of trafficking?
So this is a really good question. So the first few months we were highlighting the risks and we started, one of the first thing we tried to do was starting to put into place data gathering. It is quite a tricky issue because historically we have three sources of data on trafficking. One is case data. So when social services providers actually interact with and identify victims of trafficking and get data from them. Of course, it's all subject to data protection, but this can tell us really a lot about what's going on and what about women's actual experiences, who is being trafficked, who is most vulnerable to trafficking, et cetera. Secondly, there's law enforcement data, which does take quite a bit of time to generate. They have to go through their investigations, prosecutions, et cetera. And both of these forms of data are usually quite closely guarded. So there's not only the question of getting the data, but there's the question of getting access to anonymous data. And thirdly, then research. And we've started to see the research come out a little bit. So what we're seeing so far is this concern about a massive increase has not materialized. For the most part, people engaged in social protection are not seeing it. There have been numerous law enforcement investigations, but to date, this is not translated into prosecutions. And what we are seeing for research is not so much qualitative or quantitative research onto trafficking cases, because there's not enough to generate interesting findings, but more about needs. And here is what I think is very interesting. Women are identifying protection needs, and women are identifying challenges in accessing appropriate pathways. The providers are not seeing it as much. So I think this is the interesting area to focus on moving forward. Seeing, are we missing trafficking cases because we're not looking in the right places, or are we not be able to report on trafficking cases because they haven't happened? And I think, personally, I think it's a combination. I think the huge response to this crisis has really cut the legs out of typical risks, which is when people are absolutely impoverished and absolutely desperate that they will take any sort of offer. For the most part, the women outside of Ukraine are not in that situation. But secondly, we have started through some media monitoring and other ways, we've started to see kind of what we would expect as we move into longer term. So we've started to see women who have taken up jobs that seem pretty decent at the beginning and are decent at the beginning, but the employers start to see the situation and they start to see opportunities for exploitation. And I think what you said in your introduction, when people have to choose between paying rent and buying food, this is really, that intersect is where it really becomes problematic. And it's certainly what we've seen for migrants and displaced populations in other contexts. So the fact that for the most part, that choice does not need to be made is hugely important. But again, given the sheer size of the crisis, there are going to be people who are slipping through the cracks, and we're now starting to see some of these labor exploitation. The initial concern was sexual exploitation. What we're starting to see now is some reports of labor exploitation.
Really interesting, and especially to look at how the risks evolve over the course of the crisis. And we'll come back to Heather in a minute, but I wanted to turn to Afghanistan now. Zohra Dadgar Shafiq works to improve the living conditions of women and girls in Afghanistan. She's the co-founder and program director of Action for Development, an NGO that provides health and education services to vulnerable people in Afghanistan, namely women and girls. Zohra, one thing that people may not realize about Afghanistan is that it is one of the world's most acute internal displacement crises. So Heather talked quite a bit about what happens after Ukrainian refugees cross borders, but your country has been going through conflict and insecurity for more than 4 decades. And on top of recurring kind of disasters and climate shocks. And so displacement has become a kind of common coping strategy for many Afghans. And on top of that, it's a very unique context when it comes to women. You describe it as gender apartheid. So I'd love to hear from you how the impacts of climate and displacement play themselves out in a context in which women's role in society is viewed so differently.
Thank you very much, Heba. Thank you, Atalanti, for having me today at this panel. I am very pleased to be there and shed some light on these questions regarding Afghanistan. First of all, I wanted to say a few words about what Heather was saying, and it was really terrible to know that how women pass through all these things, because I'm one of those who migrated as a young girl from Afghanistan. It was during the previous times of Taliban, and what kind of difficulties we had gone through. And it's, for some people it might be stories, but when I remember all those days and years that we have gone through, it has been really very difficult situation. We left our home. We didn't know if we will be able to get out of the country at that point. And we just locked our house and we came back, and there was nothing afterwards. So we had to start our life from zero in another country. And I think this is the situation for a lot of people. And one of the worst impacts of migration is, in fact, that people have to lose everything, leave everything behind, and start from zero in another place. As you said, Afghanistan is one of the countries that has been subject to conflict for the last, I think, even more than 4 decades. So women have been affected at different levels. This has been a social issue, economical issue, humanitarian issue, different levels. I mean, health, education. There are many layers that could have been affected by the immigration. During the conflict, many women experience loss of their family members in Afghanistan, particularly. as the war goes on, we can see that in each family you will find someone who has been killed, a father, a child, a young man. So women who lose their family members, they tend to go through a lot of mental stress in Afghanistan, particularly, where I would say around 95% of women were illiterate. They have difficulty to find jobs. They have difficulty to cope with those situations. And unfortunately, due to the cultural understandings, some of these women will need to marry another person from within the family in order to be able to keep their children for themselves. Those women who can't or don't want to marry another, either brother of their husband or somebody else from the family, their in-laws take off their children from them and they let them go. And this has been also a very severe problem for women in Afghanistan for many, many years now. As they become widows and have no a male breadwinner, they suffer different circumstances. They go through the violence, they go through the different exploitation, discrimination. Their children are left on the streets begging. Unfortunately, Afghanistan has been a subject of internal displacement hugely because of the conflict. And it happens that if in one area of Afghanistan there is a war and fighting, then the people have to leave to another place and they leave everything behind. So there is a lot of loss of social networks, loss of economic opportunities, legal protection. The women and children have experienced a lot of risk of abuse and exploitation, including the woman trafficking. So women have been subject to be trafficked from Afghanistan to other countries. And this has not been just the case now, currently, which is happening. It has been also previously during the previous years when Taliban was ruling.
So much there, isn't there, Zohra? So much to...
There are a lot of things that Afghanistan unfortunately goes through, and women suffer because of these issues. In other countries, as you mentioned, in Ukraine, there is a possibility that the women are let to go out. So the males, they stay and fight for their country. In Afghanistan, unfortunately, it's an issue which is mixing with the human rights as well, because the women are not allowed to leave now the country. They are like in a prison, not only within their home, but within the country, because the government does not provide them, the current de facto government does not provide them any passport. They take off women from airplanes if they are not having a male family member. So a lot of issues going on in Afghanistan. We have been having a discussion about this situation, and I think it's very right to say that violation of human rights in Afghanistan, which is linked to migration and which is the core, I would say, cause of migration for Afghans, I would say women and children and girls. So this we can call as gender apartheid, and women have been, well, the current de facto government is trying to erase women, particularly from all phases, from social, economical, any type of phase. And this does not leave the woman any choice, that they need to go out of the country. They need to leave the country, which unfortunately is also not possible for many of them.
there's a question for you, Zohra, from someone in the chat around what kind of institutional support or otherwise these women have to alleviate this oppression, given the kind of cultural dynamics in Afghanistan. Obviously, you went through this yourself. So what is in place to help women in this situation?
There's nothing in place. Unfortunately, there's nothing in place in Afghanistan for the Afghan women and girls. It's life or death inside, and unfortunately today many young girls are committing suicide because they don't see any situation out for them. Being on the roads did not happen, did not bring any positive change. They have been shouting for help and to address the Taliban in order to provide them their rights, but nothing happened and nothing positive turned out of all those situations. So women unfortunately do not have any means to protect themselves.
What's the impact? You talked about suicide rates. I mean, we know that mental health conditions like anxiety and depression can double in a population that has experienced some form of humanitarian crisis. And we've seen that in our reporting from South Sudan to Somalia to the Rohingya camps, even in Bangladesh, that people who experience war and displacement undergo massive trauma. And now you're again layering on top of that a dynamic in which women's freedoms are so curtailed. What is the impact on mental health of women in Afghanistan?
Unfortunately, the impact on women's mental health is huge. They go through very difficult situations. The trauma continues affecting them, and unfortunately, at the moment, they don't have the possibilities. Even for majority of women, they don't have the possibilities of even accessing health centers. So I would say roughly in the previous years, also the issue of mental health was not one of the priority areas of the government. It was actually addressed, but not same as other essential needs of the health. Since the takeover of Taliban, the issue of mental health has been partially considered to be an important issue that needs to be addressed, but unfortunately, with the situation that women are not allowed to work anymore, particularly with the UN and international organizations, there are some exemptions for health workers, for teachers, but primarily they say that women should not go out of their houses unless it's very much needed, or they are accompanied with someone, a male from their family, which leaves those women who are widows, just not having any access to any type of services outside.
I think we should come back to this question of what's needed, especially in a situation as dire as that, because it's really depressing, frankly, to think that, these women are being just left on their own to fend for themselves. But let's finish our tour du monde first, and then we'll come back to Zohra. So turning to Latin and Central America now. Isabella Rolls is a journalist covering Central America, normally based in Guatemala. And Isabella, a lot of your reporting focuses on migration, and you have also noticed that in Latin America, women are migrating in a way that they didn't before. So tell us a little bit about what has changed.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. So over the years, as you said, migration towards the United States, in regards to the female population has increased. And this is because, there has been we've always had problems with corruption, insecurity, violence across Latin America. But now we have more problems of domestic violence, gang violence. So these women are exposed to this. They're migrating right now. Approximately 45% of migrants are women. And it's unfortunate to see statistics and see that they're not only, you know, women over the age of 18. Now we're talking about like, you know, young girls and teenagers. And as a reporter, it's sad to learn when I talk to these people, to learn that they know what they're going to go through, what this journey entails, that they're gonna maybe get raped, a lot of human trafficking, you know, selling of organs, smuggling drugs to the United States. Even though they know about all of these factors, they're willing to take the journey, to make the journey and leave everything behind. And this is because, for example, in Guatemala, over 80% of the population lives under extreme poverty, earning less than $1 per day. So there's no job opportunities, there's no access to education for these, you know, for the female population. We still have this ideology here in Central America, where, you know, males dominate. There's a lot of sexism. So basically, the female population doesn't have a choice, and that's why they migrate.
It's you raised a couple of things there that I want to touch on. One is the danger of the journey, and we've reported a lot about just how dangerous that route through, especially the Darien Gap, this kind of 65-mile trek through a jungle with rivers and mountains and poisonous snakes and criminal gangs and the risks of extortion and armed violence. How are women faring through that particular journey? Because you mentioned rape and other risks that get piled on top to what is already a really risky situation.
So I'll give you an example. I interviewed this source, and she knew that one of the risks was going to, I mean, she probably was going to get raped, or she was going to be exposed to sexual violence. So she started taking birth control before,
Wow.
you know, making the trip. And she was, you know, later deported. She wanted to reunite with a family member with, you know, a male in the United States. She was deported. And when you interview her and ask her, are you willing to do, would you do it again? And she said yes. So they're so desperate. And it's so sad, like I was saying, to learn that it's because they don't have a choice. And that's why I like to cover immigration, because I want people internationally to understand that they don't have a choice, and that unfortunately, in recent years, the female population that wants, or that migrates, is increasing, and that now we're talking about minors. So for every 3 migrants, 1 is a woman. And mostly, you know, the difference is that when males migrate, they migrate by themselves. But women in Latin America, they often immigrate with their children or with other females. And that makes them more vulnerable throughout the journey.
And I'm glad you touched on this question of choice, because of course there's this big debate in the narrative around migration between those who are considered to be forced to flee because of conflict versus those who choose to leave because of economic issues. And I think what I take away from your comments is that it isn't, as you say, a choice. It is in many ways just as unbearable a situation as those that we heard in Ukraine or in Afghanistan. There are some questions in the chat that I want to turn to that kind of shift the conversation towards solutions. So you've each painted a pretty difficult picture. So what can be done about it? And there's a kind of the big picture questions in terms of root causes, and then maybe the more short-term responses. So maybe Zuhra, I can come back to you, because I would suspect that this question from, I don't know how to pronounce it, but Nihi, is prompted by some of your comments. From your experience, what sort of support could be established to help women in Afghanistan, and how can the communities outside of Afghanistan contribute to helping? Are there initiatives that are creating any impact at all for women's freedom in this case?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I guess the external support that could help would be that those who were able to leave Afghanistan, because we know that at the moment there are a huge number of Afghans who flee the country since 21st of August. They are still in camps. They are still in a situation that they don't know what their future will be. So I guess there could be a help in that area that could be provided by the UN organizations, by international organizations. But inside the country, I guess the only thing that would help Afghanistan would be that, there are a lot of issues that one person cannot do, or a group of people cannot do, unless it's decided by the government. In other country, a government it takes a decision to do something. In Afghanistan, unfortunately, government goes against any type of human right issue for women. Education forbidden, health forbidden, working and earning money forbidden. So what's not forbidden? It's only that they can say that you should not breathe anymore. And that's the only thing that's left. And in that kind of situation, when the government does not allow any type of services for women, I guess it's very essential that the international community has to press further, find the means how to bring justice to women. And I don't see this happening over a few months, because the system that now is put there, it has spread around, and is going to be out of control, unfortunately, if they will not try to put more pressure and control Taliban as much as possible. I have seen a lot of films. The social media, for example, in Afghanistan, it's forbidden now. They do not allow people to film, particularly, I would say, in some of those provinces that have been going against Taliban, like Panjshir, Takhar, Baghlan, Ghor provinces, Daikundi and Bamyan provinces, which are highly populated by Tajik and Hazara people. These provinces are facing a lot of problems from the authorities, current de facto authorities. In Panjshir, people are being checked when they enter the province that they do not have any telephone with them. They can't even take the video of what's happening, because it's forbidden. In this kind of situation, I guess it's the only way out to continue pressing further on them and finding means, maybe through communication with them, maybe through I don't know, because sanctions does not seem to work any further.
So you've answered Atalanti's question, but maybe actually, Volkani, if you don't mind, and if it's possible, Kathleen, to have some of the participants unmute. I think this leads quite well into an idea/question that she has that speaks to this question about digital access. Volkani, are you able to unmute? And why don't you go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. And thank you for the answers. No, the question I had, because it sounds to me that kind of a direct solution that we might have that could be of impact is access to information that's curated for these women, especially the ones who've been widowed and are sort of abandoned. If nobody cares about them and there is sort of no one in, controlling their choices in that sense, right? In a way, they have that freedom of being nobody's responsibility. Could there be, is there a way, do they have access? Can they find a way to access information on their own? I know they have no way of making money, no way of having, access to sort of jobs and that sort of thing, but how do they get their information about where they need to be or where they need to be getting food or any of that? Could there be a way to
in a sense to bypass
all of that? Yeah, exactly.
So
yeah, I can take it. Unfortunately, in Afghanistan, due to poverty, due to very high poverty rate, currently, I guess the World Bank has been, I guess it's World Bank or WFP, who have been giving the figures, something nearly 95% of the country population, which is 40 million people almost, they are below the poverty line. So for them to have a mobile, to have an access to mobile and internet, it's not the priority, because they need to survive. So their in immediate priority is food, and everything that they would earn, they would put into buying food. At the moment, it's huge famine going on. It's winter, women do not work, they beg on the streets, but still, people who pass, they don't give money to them because they don't have money themselves. It's a very, very, very bad situation for women. And we have been discussing this. Actually, next week there is a UN conference in Geneva, where the discussion related to the education cannot wait will be held here in Geneva, and we will be participating in that conference, particularly Action for Development, the organization that I have. We have a set aside event to that conference where we will be discussing the necessary or needs towards the digital education and access to digital education, because I think at the moment for Ukraine, it has been provided that children of migrants, they have access to tablets and internet wherever they are, so that they can continue at least their education, even if they are hiding somewhere from the war or something. So we would like to ask during this conference, particularly, that if there could be possibilities of funding a similar situation for the girls in Afghanistan, because sitting at home doing nothing, being suppressed, not allowed to go out, this puts, as we mentioned previously, this puts a lot of pressure on their mental health. So there should be a solution, way out of it.
Maybe we can turn to Heather, because you just mentioned there the Ukraine example, and Heather, I think you talked about earlier the focus in the response to Ukrainian refugee women on what information do they need, how can they access that information, but also more broadly, I think the response to Ukraine has been successful in many fronts. So what lessons have you learned from what's working in terms of responding to women migrant needs that might be able to be replicated elsewhere?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think the situation for Ukrainian women tends to be very different. They're very much online. And what we were able to see for the specific issues that we were looking at, awareness of trafficking, the knowledge rates were quite high. The baseline was fairly well informed due to decades of work that had been done previous to the war. So there's quite a distinction there. I do think there was still some challenges because information is sometimes a low-hanging fruit for responders. So that's the first thing that everybody could do. And in our situation, there was actually sometimes just too much information. And sometimes at the wrong places. Like there was a real rush to get information to the border points, which makes sense. Responders couldn't go into Ukraine itself, but generally what we've been hearing is that uptake of knowledge at border points is not that good. And I think when we reflect ourselves, when we're in airports and border crossing points under normal circumstances, we're not hanging around digesting messaging, you know? So it's more, I think there's a lot more to be done in making things available to women in the languages they need, because we're really seeing this a problem. Responders were very good at getting materials out in Ukrainian, but having the capacity to kind of absorb that is one thing. And then kind of the second line beyond the poster, who's behind the poster? And often those numbers were linking to people that didn't speak Ukrainian. And first responders and law enforcement didn't speak Ukrainian. So information is a necessary condition, but it's also not sufficient. And there has to be kind of the procedures in place to back that up. To me, what I think is working is obviously we're seeing very different responses and a lot of different services being available, a lot of regular pathways. And obviously coming from the migration sector, this is something I pay attention to, but I think we're really seeing that it counts. People become desperate very quickly when they're in irregular situations and highly vulnerable. And in this situation, women don't have to worry about that. And, you know, it might not be the easiest. I'm not saying it is the easiest, but they can reach out and eventually probably connect with somebody who's able to assist them. And this is critically different. And I think what we're seeing now is discussions about what can be replicated, the importance of both social protection and regular pathways, and how this really reduces a lot of vulnerabilities in a meaningful way.
And unfortunately, the reality, even in the Ukraine response, we saw that if you were trying to cross the border out of Ukraine and you were African, you got stuck behind. And if you were, frankly, blonde-haired and blue eyes, you were welcomed with open arms. And so that racism basically getting in the way of what people who are both in the same situation as asylum seekers get very, very different treatments. And I think that's a really difficult piece to address, because it depends not just on best practice, but also then on political will. We're also seeing that in Latin America or Central America, of course. So a real challenge. I know Clara, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. You had your hand up earlier. Did you still want to ask a question?
Yeah, Clara.
Clara.
Thanks so much for all of you for sharing these experiences from around the world, and for reminding us that it's most often not a choice, that they don't have a choice, but they really have to. And that really spoke for me also to the Mediterranean route and Libya and the stories we hear from there. And kind of that shows so starkly how women take all the risks on themselves because they don't have a choice. So I have two questions. The first one is, I think, mainly going to Isabella, but maybe the others also can comment on it. In cases where women are forced to flee because of their being women, because of them being women, so femicide, sexual violence, these reasons, is how do you see the legal recognition of that then in the countries they arrive? Like, is that recognized? And of course, then so my second question is kind of connected to that, and also to what you told from Afghanistan, that the trauma goes like way beyond what people, like women, experienced in their countries of origin, but there's layers of trauma, and I think there's a higher risk of re-traumatization if these conversations on the status determination and so on aren't like prepared carefully and taken into consideration the different circumstances of women on the move. So I'm wondering, like, maybe you could speak a bit to your experience in countries of in host countries, and like how these women specific reasons are taken into account. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. That's a very interesting question. specifically in Latin America and, specifically talking about Central America, where there's a lot of domestic violence, gender-based violence, when they try to migrate and move to the United States, unfortunately, these cases are so common that they get deported, and so it's not something that they think that it's something that they're like it's gonna help them, get into the United States and everything, and it's so unfortunate, but it's so common that it's not an excuse anymore, and it's very unfortunate.
So I see, Neve, that you've got a question. I'm going to turn to you in a second, but I want to also ask a bit about, I mentioned earlier the short-term challenges of responding and whether you can get legal protection and asylum. And then there are the longer-term questions of how do you reduce the drivers of migration? And we've talked about quite a number of different ones, from gender-based violence to conflict to poverty. But do you all see a common root cause that needs to be addressed? And I'm thinking things like good governance or views of women in society, or Heather, you were talking about legal pathways for migration, and how hopeful can we be that those root causes ever get tackled? Heather, I see you nodding. Or Isabella, go first.
I'm going to jump right onto that one.
Okay.
If you don't mind, I'll answer Neve's question briefly, and then I do have quite a lot to say about the drivers of migration, so feel free to shut me down when it gets too much. I think the private action need was really very interesting in the Ukraine crisis, and I think a lot of credit has to be given to the general population. The response, I think it's worthy of highlighting, the Polish response, just the society organizing itself, and individual private action having a massive protection impact, and I think this must be acknowledged. I think we also have to be aware, and the Protection Working Group issued guidance on this, is that private action doesn't have oversight. And there are concerns with people showing up with vans and saying, I will take you somewhere. And there's been some documented journalist cases where this did not end well. So I think we have to acknowledge the role of society and of individuals, but I do think that there's some fairly straightforward steps that can be taken, individuals agreeing to register their vehicles or registering with local authorities. And we're seeing over time the role of municipalities in this, just letting officialdom know that you're hosting a vulnerable population. And then individuals themselves also letting officialdom know, because then if there's complaints, if problems start to happen, there can be some recourse. So I think it is a balance between efficiency and protection sometimes. Can I go straight into drivers of migration as well?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit of an advertisement. So IOM did write a very big book on this in 2019 on protection and assistance for vulnerable migrants. And what we were specifically looking at there was migrants who were vulnerable to violence, exploitation, and abuse, and really trying to understand what can be done holistically to address this. So generally, our talking point is we are, of course, not anti-migration, but we want to see migration as a choice, as somebody fulfilling personal aspirations and not forced or compelled to migrate. So what we have developed is a determinants of migrant vulnerability model, because we really have to look at this holistically, and it uses an ecological approach that understands that migrants are individuals who are embedded in their families, in their communities, and in their societies, and that there's risk factors that can push migrants into risky migration at all of these different levels, and they interact differently. And I think, I often, when I train on this, I often use gender as an example, because gender is encoded, embedded, and enforced at all of these different levels. So we have families who are practicing gender discrimination, communities that are, and laws and policies that uphold this. So the point really is that we have to look at all of these different levels and traditionally we've been a bit caught up at the individual level. Okay, here's your individual characteristics. Let's address your individual needs. And then you want to go back home, great. Let's put you plunk right back in the family you left, in the community you left, with the same laws and social factors. And it's really just not sufficient. We have to think holistically. And just to flag there also that we're not only looking at the negatives and the risk factors at these different levels, but there are strengths and capacities at these different levels that often are not mobilized. But if we're mobilizing the capacities that exist, this is more likely to be sustainable. Over.
Isabella, I know you wanted to come in also on this question of the long-term, or sorry, the root causes of migration.
Yes, so I wanted to say that in the case of Latin America, I think that because poverty rates and corruption and security, these rates are increasing, and we know that unfortunately they're not going to decrease anytime soon. I think it would be ideal to build and create more resilient institutions, and create programs to empower these women, to make them feel, because for example, when I interview them, all of these women have dreams like any of us. They dream to become a stylist, they dream to become musicians, but unfortunately they don't have access to education or job opportunities, or they think they don't have access. So creating programs to make them feel empowered, that's what we need in the short term.
And have you seen any examples of success in that regard?
Yes, for example, here in Guatemala, the textile industry is very important, and these women who live in communities where textiles are unique, they like to create their designs. So there's certain NGOs helping them, have jobs and use their skills in the textile industry to earn money.
It's Zohra, I'm gonna give you like a heads up, because I want to ask you for where you do see some optimism or hope, because it's really difficult in these kinds of conversations where the issues seem so big to figure out what can actually be a way forward. And in particular, in a case like Afghanistan, I know. Sorry?
I would say left the building now.
Oh, sorry, that wasn't for us. And in particular, when it's a question of a country that is caught in the midst of, geopolitical dynamics and wars that are not even always of its making, how you can see a way forward. So you might need a bit more time to think about the reason for optimism or what you see as a path out of this. But when looking at that kind of underlying drivers in Afghanistan's case, what do you see as a way forward?
As you said, it's very, very difficult to think about something like this because we lost our hope. We really lost our hope, and the engagement of 42 countries in the war against terror did not yield anything positive. It even further destroyed the situation in Afghanistan. Currently, with all the I think if I would describe it in a way that it's a cage where a huge number of people are pressed together and they don't have any means to go out of it, and either they are killed or maintained. Yesterday I was watching a very sad claim from one of the persons, and he was saying that if we work, we get robbed. If we steal, we get killed. We don't have any means to go out of the country, and we don't have any way to survive inside the country. So unfortunately, Afghanistan is in such situation. And when you were speaking about the drives for the migration, it is that desperate situation when they just want to survive. That's the only wish that they have. It's nothing about, for Afghanistan, the issue of sexual exploitation, the issue of lack of access to health, lack of access to education, this has not been now a priority today. It's not any priority. Today, it's for them, the priority is only survival. And so, unfortunately, this is a very desperate situation. I think Afghanistan has been subject to the power fighting, over all these 40 years. And, it's like a ball of power being dropped to one end, then to another end. And unfortunately, the people who, they suffer. It does not really reflect the top, governmental situation, because one day the government is supported by one party, another day the government is supported by other party, but who suffer are the people. And within people, it is particularly women and girls who are the most vulnerable aspects, as I don't want to repeat all those things that we have already said, why they are, their health issues, their women, physical issues. They have pregnancy issues, they have menstruational issues, they have all those things that are just women who suffer. And when they migrate, it's just out of desperate need in Afghanistan. So the thing, how we can help this, it is, to my opinion, it's not the possibility that Afghan people would do it themselves now. It is the policymakers who have to come to a suggestion. Because as you already mentioned, in Ukraine, the level of literacy was very high. Access to all digital systems was very high. People are literate, they can read, write, reach whatever they want to do. In Afghanistan, people are illiterate, they don't know how to, even very simple things, they don't know how to address them. So it's a very, very different yes. level of comparison. And at this point, it's only the policymakers who have to come up with a right policy to be settled for the country.
So there's at the risk of turning this into a really big geopolitical discussion that feels way too macro, I think I would offer a role also for, alongside the policymaking, which we'll get to just now, because there's a question around that for you, Heather, but that in the same way you talked about the need for advocacy by the international community in putting pressure for change, I think we as global citizens also have a role to play in these geopolitical questions. And if you look at the origins of the problem in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, or the people who the origins of the Taliban, were supported by the United States to fight the Russians way back when. And so this foreign intervention does mean that there's a space, I think, for citizens of the countries that are intervening to speak up and also try to shape the policies of their governments in their countries in what they're doing. And we've seen that be effective in cases where, for instance, going to war in Iraq was prevented by certain countries because of the opposition of their people. So just to say, I think there is still space for an informed kind of active global citizenry to shape the way forward. But on a more concrete level, there's a question to you, Heather, that if the government is not going to be the one to act in the interest of women in Afghanistan, is that an opportunity then for aid agencies like IOM to take on the quote unquote burden of legal protection of women, and from there to be able to provide specific information that these women can use to avoid some of the dangers that they're exposed to. So basically, in a way, almost taking the role of government and how you would go about doing that. And then just before you answer that, I'm going to try to close with each of you giving us kind of one starting point as a way forward on these questions, small as it may be. So Zohra, get your thinking caps on for that ray of hope. Heather.
Thanks. It's a difficult question, Makani. I think that this is always a tension that we do see, because the general starting point is that we want to advocate and encourage states to fulfill their protection functions. Obviously, some of these situations, there's an absolute failure for them to do so. But some functions we simply can't substitute. When it comes to information, I think absolutely, to the extent possible. I think also we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of operational challenges for NGOs and the international community, even getting access and operating in Afghanistan. So there's just so many levels of challenges in that context that it's quite disheartening. So I'm not sure I've really hit the nail on the head with the response, but we're all trying to do the best we can, I think, and ensure that protection, wherever there's an opportunity to enhance protection, that we take it to the full extent of our capacity, recognizing that often our capacities remain low.
I will just add to that, from our reporting and what we hear from people on the ground, there is a huge tension, as you're alluding to, Heather, because when that starts happening at scale, there's a very thin line between kind of foreign countries doing what they want or foreign NGOs kind of implementing foreign agendas that aren't in line with, first of all, aren't in line with what the local people really want and need, and second of all, aren't sustainable because it's a kind of a parallel system that is not rooted in structures that can stay on the long term. So it's a real dilemma, I think, for many organizations working in those spaces where the government is not necessarily being conducive to its population's needs. With that, we've just got a few minutes left. So I know this has been a rather depressing is too strong of a word, but difficult topic. And I would like to end on where you are seeing opportunities for hope, or one kind of starting point to addressing some of the challenges that we've talked about, as big or small as it may be. So Heather, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, I'll focus really specifically on my role, which is in the anti-trafficking sector. And there's been a lot of attention over the past 15 to 20 years on how trafficking and sexual violence operates in conflict. And there hasn't been a lot of learning yet. And I would say what we have found, and I've already said it, but it's tremendously meaningful if we can put in place protections early on, and these two that we've seen, access to basic social protection, access to regular pathways. This looks like potentially it's a highly effective counter-trafficking strategy post-conflict, and this is a massive bit of learning. So it's important for Ukraine, but I think it's important globally if we can encourage replication.
And more broadly, I think Ukraine has shown what is possible when countries decide they are going to unite to try to support people in need, and just how possible, well, just how easy is the wrong word, because it was not easy, but just how possible it is. And if that same, all this idea that dealing with refugees is a burden, and that et cetera, we've just shown that that doesn't have to be true. So I think that's reason for optimism. Isabella.
Well, yeah, so knowing that and taking into consideration that we know that, insecurity and violence are going to continue across the region. There's certain programs that are new, but that are empowering women, as I mentioned before. So what they need, what these females need to feel is that they're included, and that they have access to education, that they can have, they can get educated as well, and they don't have to be stay-at-home moms or or people that, you know, just exist to take care of their husbands. So, you know, gradually this sexist ideology is kind of changing, and we're improving in that sense, slowly.
Zohra, final word to you.
Thank you. So I think that there are two areas of hope for Afghanistan. Although I don't see a very drastic change to happen over the next few years, maybe. There are two issues that can help the situation of women in Afghanistan. And the first thing would be that, again, I would say UN, maybe because it's the only hope that we have for. And if the UN could come up with a mechanism that would address establishment of a government that could be responsible for its citizens. And I think it's now the only responsibility that UN can take further. A mechanism that would help in establishing a government responsible and you know, a government that could comply with the needs and would really work towards development of the country, not towards destroying the country. And another hope that I have is that hopefully this is a very complicated situation, I would say, because unfortunately, radicalism has been funded for many years to create those radical soldiers, you know, mind-washed, or the machines that believe in something very particular. And this has been funded for several years to create them. And I think at this point, we realize that having those type of radical thinkers is very dangerous, not only for Afghanistan, but for Middle East, and then worse for the whole globe. I guess we have to put efforts to make you know, the schools that eradicate those radicalism thinking, and this could be something that the world can do together.
Thank you very much, Zohra, and I will echo Ariane's comments in the chat. Thank you to all of the speakers for your thoughts today, and to all of you participating for your very good questions. I will just say for more on the conditions of women in settings of conflict and displacement, you can check out our content, thenewhumanitarian.org. Heather had mentioned a resource, and Heather, there was a question for you in the chat. If you could just drop in the link for IOM's book. And then, of course, for more such events, givingwomen.ch/events. Atalanta, do you want to say any final words before we sign off? You're on mute, I'm afraid.
Yeah. I'd like to thank you, Heather, for moderating absolutely beautifully. Thank you, Zora, Heather, and Isabella, for your honesty, your responses, which were so powerful. I think it is a really sad situation. And, you know, we've had Zora speak for us before, and the hope becomes less each time I hear you speak, Zora, and I understand so much why. I think a lot of what we're talking about is related to women's rights and the access. You all said access to education. The difference for the Ukrainian women is that they're educated, that they have the ability to work in general, and they have the ability to integrate. So I think we need to keep working very, very hard. I think we need to keep this conversation out there, and this is something that we at Giving Women feel very strongly about. We don't want these stories, so we're very much in parallel with the New Humanitarian in a small way, but really getting those conversations out there so people realize what's going on, because the general press does not discuss these issues, and we need to keep them in the discussion. One of the things we didn't discuss, and which I think is also, so we talked about the triggers at home, what we can change so there is not this displacement happening, so people can stay in their homes. Women are not frightened as they are, and they don't have choices in Central and Latin America because they are being treated not only badly, but also victims of gender-based violence and domestic violence. But one of the things, and I'm myself Greek, and I have a project for women who are refugees in Greece, is the issue around host countries. Host countries also need to recognize, and I think Isabella said it so well, the Americans don't recognize the situation of these women, and that they're really in danger, and being deported back to their homes puts them in further danger. And we need to also educate the host countries that, yes, we've been amazing with the Ukrainians, but as Heba said very correctly, they're blonde and blue-eyed and look like, well, not like me, but look like the Europeans. And I think that there is an incredible difference between the way that, and I think also Zura, you mentioned it, about the way that young Afghans who arrive in Greece or in any of those countries, how they're treated. And so I think we need to put pressure on the international community to stop this narrative around economic migrants and forced migrants, and really recognize that this is a humanitarian issue. And if we're really true humanitarians, we need to provide that support for all human beings. So not a very hopeful conversation, but I think a very engaging one. And I would like to thank everybody. I look forward to sharing this conversation. I know that a lot of people had signed up. We had about 70 people sign up, and we will be sending out the recording of this so more people will hear it. So thank you all for attending. Thank you for your wonderful questions, and we'll keep going on these issues. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.